I'm Eva, and I would like to welcome you to another episode of The Charm of It, my knitting podcast, in which I tell you about anything I finished, what I'm currently working on, and talk about some general knitting topics. This is probably going to be a really long episode because March is my knitting anniversary. I've been knitting for 3 years now, and I thought it would be really fun to do a bit of a retrospective. And so, yeah, there's a lot to talk about. I'd like to apologize for the slightly different setup. My neck and shoulders have been really bad lately, so I pretty much need to have a heating pad on them all the time, which is why I'm also in the bigger armchair. And I can't really reach for the lens to hold things out as much as usual, so I switched lenses on my camera, and hopefully that will help so you'll still be able to see a little bit of detail when I hold it up. I am further from the camera, so I'm speaking a bit more loudly. Hopefully, in editing, I'll be able to fix any noise issues. I apologize in advance for any thumps you might hear. I have a new upstairs neighbor who apparently believes that the courtesies of communal living do not apply to him. You can imagine how happy I am about that. Hopefully, he'll figure things out soon. Okay, so all of those caveats aside, I am so excited to be chatting with you guys again. I would like to welcome back everyone who has subscribed, and of course welcome any new visitors. I am not usually that cranky. Sleep deprivation is not good for me. And for any new viewers, when I say my neck and shoulders are bad, it's because I have chronic illnesses and they're flaring up. And I think that those are all the technicalities. I'm only drinking water today. I had an iced coffee yesterday, and I don't really drink coffee much. And I just had a total caffeine and sugar rush, and then later I crashed. So I'm sticking with a lower caffeine day today. As you can see, just about see, Thistle is one of my co-hosts. She's my dog. My cat Moth is sleeping behind me. She may come over the chair later. That's her usual method to get into my lap here. And all of that, excuse me, let us get chatting. I thought I would talk about my finished objects first and then move on to other things. So first of all, I finished my Hare in the Moon mittens. Thistle, lay down, honey. Puppy. Okay. Here they are in the front. Thistle's determined to mess up the focus. And here they are converted into mitts. And there's the top. I realized that I showed you these as a work in progress last episode, and I thought I had already talked about them when I hadn't, so I'll talk about the details today. I knit them out of Quince & Company's Owl, which is a 50% alpaca, 50% wool, worsted weight yarn, and it's spun woolen instead of worsted. So that's why it's got this lovely fluffy halo. I really love this yarn for mittens. I knit my dad a pair of mittens out of this, and once you block it, it becomes this beautiful, warm, cohesive fabric. The green is hemlock, and the very light gray is elf, I believe. It's on my project page for information. And the pattern is a free pattern on Ravelry called Somerset versus Norway. I don't really know why it's called that, but it's really pretty. I did have to modify it. I changed the cuff entirely just for fun because I received Alice Darmore's Fair Isle book for Christmas, and so now I have too many charts to play with. For the body, my hands are fairly small, and Owl, I like it knit up at 5 or 6 stitches to the inch, and so I had to take out several stitches, and I followed another Ravelry user's suggestions for that, and I also had to shorten it a bit, so I discussed that in my project page as well. And of course, I made them convertible. So I followed a tutorial that's linked in my project page, and I'm so thrilled with how it came out. Basically, what you do is when you get to the part where you want it to be folded over, here's what it looks like, regular. You knit a row of waste yarn across the palm, and then you go back and knit back into that waste yarn. So the same way that you would do an afterthought thumb, or I believe an afterthought heel, although I have not done that. And then once you're finished with the mitten, you go back and you pull those stitches out, And on this side, so now you've got live stitches on the top and the bottom. And on the top, you just knit a little bit of ribbing and you leave long ends to seam it together. And on the bottom, you have all these stitches live, and then you cast on stitches around here so that once again you're knitting in a circle, and you knit that ribbing, and then at the end you just sew the back on. And here's what it looks like on. It was super effective, and it doesn't mess up the pattern at all, so I'm really excited about all of the stranded colorwork mittens that I can make convertible now, because usually when I'm outside, Thistle is with me, and in the winter, her paws get ice in between the pads, and the best way to deal with that is for me to use my fingertips to melt it. So it's much more convenient for me to just be able to flip up the top, and of course also for picking up after her. It's nice to have that flexibility. Before I blocked them, I thought that this was a little bulky, and I was going to suggest knitting this part in a lighter weight yarn, but once I bulked them, or blocked, not bulked, once I blocked them, they just worked beautifully. So I am very thrilled with how these came out. The other thing was a new technique for me, here they are, is the braids. I've never done a Latvian braid, but I was reading the Tech Knitter blog, and she talked about a faux Latvian braid, which is a crocheted chain, and she made it sound simple, so I decided to try that out. Oh my gosh, it took so long. And I used to crochet, so when I'm just crocheting, I would say I'm fairly quick, but the fiddliness of trying to crochet into a cylinder, and especially on the 2-color braid, so you're switching yarn every round, it took forever. It took an hour and a half to add the braids to each of the mitts, or each of the cuffs. That includes leaving in the ends because, of course, since you're doing it afterwards, you end up with 8 more ends to weave in. So I will not be doing that again. I'll be trying the actual Latvian braid. I do think that doing a crochet chain would be worth it if you were doing swirls or something that you actually can't achieve with knitting, but otherwise it's just too fiddly. So between that and then, so I thought I was done, and I realized that on the second mitten I had made one of the braids go the opposite direction, like I wanted, mirrored, and the other one I had done the wrong way, so I had to rip it out and do it again. Whew. So between that and the conversion, there were 40 ends to weave in on this project, which I think is a record for me. The only thing that might have more ends is a striped baby blanket that I did. But totally worth it for the final result. I'm utterly in love with them. And I knit these as part of NH Claire's Mitten Along. It was Stranded Colorwork Mittens, and it's still going. It goes through March 18th, I believe. And her podcast is NH Knits, and I highly recommend it if you have not listened to it yet. When I come back, I'll talk about my other finished project. My other finished project is something that you've also seen, and those are my Chagall in Shadow socks. This is my first attempt at knee-high socks, and I am super pleased with how they turned out. I wore them yesterday, so they look kind of weird when they're not being worn. I knit them with a lot of negative ease to hopefully get them to stay up, and that means, of course, they have to be much longer than my leg, because once you put them on, the ribbing stretches. But they fit perfectly. You'll see a photo of them on in the Knits in the Wild segment, and they didn't slide down at all. And they come to just below my knee. So these are knit out of Mountain Colors Barefoot, one skein, which is 400 yards, and I wanted to get as much as I could out of them. So I did contrasting heels and toes out of just some leftover Quince & Company's Turn that I had from another pair of socks I knit. This is the Barnacle colorway. And it was a gift from a kind knitting friend, Susan, who wanted me to be able to try out her favorite sock yarn, and I can see why. It is so warm and cozy, and I love the halo that the mohair gets. It's a hand-painted yarn. This is the Osprey colorway, and it's so beautiful. It's like a very, very dark rainbow. And I used the Blueberry Waffle sock pattern. I knit from the toe up since I was trying to maximize length. And because this is a thicker yarn, and because ribbing is stretchy, I only needed 44 stitches for my foot. I wear a size 6.5 to 7 US, around a Euro 37. I'm not sure what the UK one is. And it just worked really well. For calf shaping, I didn't do much because I did quite a bit of calf shaping on my leg warmers and they tend to slouch. So all I did was I changed needle sizes from 0 to 1 to 1.5 every, I think it was 20 rows. And then once I got up to my calf, I just added 4 stitches, which is about 10%. So I went from 44 to 48. And then at the end, with the regular ribbing at the top, I went down back again to 44. And I use Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off, which usually I don't like it because of the frill. But in this case, I needed all that stretch in order to be able to get them over my calf. So I am very pleased with how these turned out. I can definitely see knitting more knee-high socks and leg warmers in the future, but I will admit by about halfway through the second sock, I was ready for them to be over. So I think I need to readjust my expectations a little because when you're used to knitting shorter socks, you're like, why is this project still going on? But I use 99 grams out of the 100. I'm going to include the little leftover butterfly in my project photo because I'm quite proud of myself for that, although really my scale did most of the work. And yeah, it's pretty interesting. I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it because this is a darker yarn, but as I changed needle size and then later changed stitch sizes, the way that the colors were knitting up changed a little. So I'll try to photograph that on my project page because, as you know, if you've watched most of my podcasts, I tend to use solid yarn, not variegated yarn. So it's interesting to see a variegated yarn knit up. I just realized I forgot to tell you what I'm wearing. It's under the heating pad. I'm wearing my Melusine cardigan, which I knit out of Quince & Company's Turn using a pattern that I designed from the Twisted Stitch Knitting Stitch Dictionary, which is Bavarian style twisted stitches. So those are my finished objects, and we're going to take a break and do a little tip segment before we go on to works in progress. I do have several questions, and I'm going to answer one of them later in my topics segment. So for this tip, I wanted to talk about cabling without cable needles because I'm currently working on a cabled cardigan, and I cannot imagine doing it with cable needles. I cable without a cable needle. I just find it much faster and more convenient, and I don't have to try to keep track of the cable needle. But it's one of those things that's simpler to show than tell. So last week, I recorded a segment of me knitting and showing you how I do it. And I'm also going to find other tutorials to link to in case that's more helpful because this is my first time trying to record a tutorial, and I recorded with the camera in front of me above my hands, and when I was watching it to make sure that it had recorded, I realized that it kind of has a mirror image effect. So I'm going to see if I can flip it in editing, but if I can't, I'm sorry for any confusion. But let's go and do that tip section now. Hi guys! For the tip this episode, I really wanted to talk about how fun and easy it is to cable without a cable needle. And since I don't tend to be very good at just talking about knitting, I thought I would go ahead and show you. This is my first tutorial that I've tried to film. I hope that it works, and apologies for any learning bumps along the way. I've only ever cabled holding the yarn in my left hand, continental style, so I can't show all of you right yarn holding knitters how to do it, but there are a lot of tutorials for this on YouTube. I just thought I'd show you my way since it's easy for me to pop into the podcast and you don't have to follow a separate link. So we're just getting to the cable. And this cable requires me to do 2 different cables. And the first one is crossing these 3 stitches. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with my focus. Okay, these 3 stitches to the right, so in front of these 3 stitches. Although I think that's actually, so it's known as a right cable cross or a back cable cross because the early stitches are going towards the back. I always think of cables in terms of right and left because thinking of them in terms of front and back, I inevitably get confused. So to cable without a cable needle, first I put my right needle tip in the 3 stitches that are going to move, and since they're moving to the right, I put it in the front. Then I use this finger to kind of pinch the other 3 stitches, and I move all 6 stitches off the left needle. And then I put those first 3 stitches back on the left needle. Does that make sense? So it looks like this, and then you put them back on. Then you just pop them down, and you put the 3 stitches from the right needle back on the left needle, and you are ready to knit. Of course, this works over knit purls too. And there is your right cable cross. So, to do a left one, which is when we want these 3 stitches smoothed to the left or to the front of the stitches behind. So in this case, I take the right tip of my needle and I put it in the back of these 3 stitches because I want them to go to the back. Then using my thumb in front, and I'm just lightly pinching. If I had a more slippery yarn, I would pinch more tightly just to make sure that nothing's going to move. I slide the 6 stitches off the needle, then I put the left needle through those front stitches, put the 3 stitches from the right needle back on the left needle, and we're ready to knit again. Oh, unless I split my yarn. There we go. I usually make sure that first stitch I snug the yarn up just to make sure that nothing is getting stretched out. And there you have the left cable cross. As you can see, it's really simple and easy. It sounds a little scary at first, but the stitches really aren't going anywhere. And this makes cabling so much more enjoyable. You don't have to make sure that you have a cable needle with you, and I just find it much easier to work a good rhythm. So there you have it. That is my tip, and I will see you guys very shortly in the regular podcast episode. Bye! So hopefully that was helpful. I highly, highly suggest trying out cabling without a cable needle if you haven't. I can't imagine going back to using a cable needle now. And now we will talk about my works in progress. Oh, sorry, I'm just going to keep it on my lap so I don't have to reach so much. We'll talk about the sweater first, since you saw that in the video. I finished the back, and I blocked the body pieces as well. Okay. So here's the back, and as you can see, I had to do an extra round of cabling here, in order to try to center the pattern vertically, and then I forgot that when you're shaping a neck, you end up doing extra rows up here, so I still didn't quite center. There's some extra just rib rounds here. But other than that, I'm super pleased with it. And, you know, it's my first sweater, or first cabled sweater. It doesn't have to be perfect. I'm learning as I go. And that brings me to something that I wanted to talk about, which was Abby. Abby, who has a cat named Lucy. And she's also now podcasting, actually, Knitting with Lucy. So you should definitely watch her. She's on YouTube. So she and I chat quite a bit on Instagram, and she mentioned that she was so impressed at how effortless designing my own knitting seemed to be for me. And I certainly do not want to give that impression. I think I'm trying to always encourage other people to start designing their own knitting if they think it's too complicated. And so I focus on the easy parts of it. But of course I make mistakes and mess up and all of that stuff too. So yeah, I certainly, as you can see, I still, even thinking through it, I didn't quite manage to center that cable vertically. And when I first started, I thought I wouldn't even have to fuss because it was like a 28 row repeat, and that fit perfectly into how many cables I needed to knit on this side. But then once I'd done the full chart once, I realized that it ended here. So it ended at a different place than it began, and so it would look weird if I just did full chart repeat. So I had to kind of adjust as I went. And yeah, I rip out quite frequently. And then when I'm doing my own thing, like I was telling you last time how I figured out how many to cast on. And so I knew that I needed to have 16 stitches for each honeycomb part of the peplum and 3 for each of this. But I literally on graph paper wrote out 16, 3, 16, 3 in the diagram that I needed, rather than just do it in my head. I find that graph paper and a pencil are hugely helpful because, yeah, sometimes what I think is going to work in my head, once I do it on graph paper, I realize that I've overlooked something. And whenever I use just the calculator on my phone, and whenever I'm working on math, I always try to triple check. Oh, here's Moth. I always try to triple check my numbers by redividing or multiplying because I find I frequently make errors just in my arithmetic as well, so that's a way to catch them. And I need to start a new segment. Moth is going to be pleased. Once I finished the back, I went ahead and blocked the back and the front pieces. And then usually I would have cast on the sleeve right away, but I had to wait a little bit because my neck and shoulders were hurting too much. So now I have cast on the sleeve, and I'm doing it mainly in plain stockinette, but I'm having one OXO cable running up the center, and that's also going to run, it's going to be a saddle shoulder, so it's going to run all the way up. And I thought that would be a nice echo to the peplum, which is honeycomb. For the cuff, clearly I decided to do something a little fancy too, since I was going to be doing a mainly stockinette sleeve. And this is another one of those instances where I had to try out multiple things before I found something that worked. Sorry, I'm going to have to readjust. Okay. So I turned to my Barbara Walker stitch pattern book, which I so love having a physical copy now. I was gifted one from a knitting friend, and before that I'd always used knittingfool.com, which is an online free stitch dictionary. But being able to flip through one in person is just wonderful, so I have seen the light now. Okay, so, and I found a few decorative ribbing, and originally I was going to go with a different one, but when I tried it out in person, it just didn't work as well. So I ended up starting this cuff 4 times before I found something that worked. The last time I realized that I really liked this, which I think it's the little hourglass rib. I'll see if it's on Knitting Fool and link to it. But the plain, you can come over. Oh, it's okay. The plain cast on just didn't look weighty enough. Hi, baby. Sorry, guys, about her flashing you. And so what I ended up doing was an I-cord cast on, but I did it in seed stitch instead of stockinette since there's so much seed stitch in the peplum. And then I just did a little eyelet row right after it. And I was a little worried because in the past when I've done I-cord cast ons, they've been a little inflexible. So I was casting on 40 or 44 stitches. So I went ahead and did an I-cord with 48 rows, and then I just skipped a certain amount, so there's more flexibility in the I-cord, and I think it worked really well because as you can see it stretches. And I made the cuff a little bit longer because I wanted to echo just a little bit leg of mutton style sleeves. I don't know, when I think about this story and imagining the kind of sweater a fisherman would knit for a selkie, it just seemed like longer, tighter cuffs would be more useful. I was going to show you the buttons which I ordered and which came in and that I'm super excited about, but I believe Moth might be sleeping on them. So we'll save that for another day. Yeah, so that's coming along really well. I love knitting sleeves. They're basically like socks, but without the heels, and just go round and round. They seem to almost knit themselves. The other 2 works in progress I have are new. And speaking of knitting itself, I cast on for a second cardigan once I finished the back of my Selkie Second Skin cardigan. I've never knit more than one sweater at the same time before, but it was the beginning of March, and I knew that if I wanted to have a chance of wearing whatever I was going to knit, I needed to start another sweater right away. And a very kind knitting friend, I can't remember if she wanted to me to name her or not, so I will not, gifted me the Little Waves pattern by Gudrun Johnston, which I thought would be a perfect match for this yarn I've had in stash for a while. It's Beaver Slide, it's their heavy sock DK weight in the Mountain Twilight colorway, which is this really pretty purple. And Gudrun Johnston used Brooklyn Tweed, which is another woolen spun yarn, and she used the heavier version of it. So looking at the pattern, I thought that the stitch was a lace pattern, and it wasn't until I downloaded it that I realized it's actually a textured pattern, which is wonderful, and I definitely will use it at some point in the future. But Beaver Slide yarn is 80% merino and 20% mohair, kid mohair. And the first sweater I ever knit was out of this yarn. And I knit it out of the lighter sock, and I knit it at a very dense gauge. And that sweater is so warm, which is wonderful, except most of the year I don't need a super incredibly warm sweater, so I don't get to wear it as frequently as I would otherwise. So with this, since it's a heavier weight yarn than I usually knit sweaters out of, I wanted to knit it at a very loose gauge, and I wanted it to have a lace pattern with open work to help keep me cooler. So I started swatching, once again from my Barbara Walker book. The Little Wave sweater, the texture has these really pretty vertical curvy lines. So I wanted to find a lace pattern that would do that too. And I settled on this one, which is Traveling Vines. And then the pattern calls for 5 stitches per inch, but I ended up really happy with my swatch at 3.5 stitches per inch. So I had to do some math. And just to show you, so I know I'm always talking about how woolen spun yarn changes a lot when it's blocked. But so here it is on knit that hasn't been blocked, and here's the swatch. The only difference is that this one has been blocked, and by blocked I mean it spent like half an hour in a sink of soapy water with the no rinse wool wash, and then it's been patted out and left flat to dry. So that's the only difference, but look at how much more cohesive and beautiful this is. But it's also quite rustic looking, so that's the other reason why I thought it would be nice to have a kind of lacy pattern play against the contrast. So as you can see, when you're knitting at 3.5 stitches per inch, things go fast. I haven't been able, I think I started this, I don't even know if I've been working on it for a week. I think probably a week. And this is the entire body part, and I'm already past the waist decreases and onto the waist increases. So as I said, I did have to do some math. And Little Waves is a paid for pattern, but I think I can tell you the basic math I did without giving it away. So let me find the right sheet of graph paper. So I have a kind of grandfather style, I guess you would call it, cardigan, you know, with the pockets and longer, that's store-bought, that I really like. So I took those measurements, and it turned out that it was 31 inches across the hips, and it went up to about 34.5 inches across the bust, and it was 26 inches long. And so since this is a bottom-up sweater, I knew that I was wanted to start at around 31 inches, and I'm going to add a little bit of waist shaping, like the pattern calls for, but not very much. I went down to 29 inches for the waist, and my waist is 24 to 25 inches, so that's still quite a bit of positive ease. Anyway, sorry, now I'm throwing numbers at you. Okay, so once I knew that I wanted it to be 31 inches in circumference around the hips, then I divided that in two, so I got 15.5 inches for the back width. And since my stitch gauge was 3.5 stitches per inch, that meant about 54 stitches. For the front half, I needed to account for the button band, so I took an inch off for the button band, and then so I got 7.25 inches for each of the front halves. So I took 15.5 minus 1 is 14.5 divided by 2, because there are 2 front halves, and you get 7.25 inches, which is about 25 stitches with my gauge. So then I knew about how many stitches I needed to cast on. And my lace pattern repeat is an 8-stitch repeat. So luckily for me, the pattern has these little panels on the side where you're not knitting in the stitch. Here it is. So that made it easier to account for. So for the back, I ended up doing 6 repeats of the lace, so that was 48 stitches, which means that I had 6 stitches left over, so on each side I put 3 of those stitches into this panel. And then the fronts, I ended up doing 3 repeats, which took 24 stitches, so I put 1 stitch of each of those into the panel. And then I wanted the panels a little bigger, so I added a few extra stitches just for looks. And 31 inches around my hips is negative ease, and I decided that I could do with it a little slouchy around my hips. So that's how I decided how many to cast on, in case that was helpful to anyone. Once again, I don't do this in my head, I write it out on paper. So here's my little, and I'll be back to talk about yet. I've just realized that this is going to be an incredibly long episode, so feel free to divide it and, watch half of it this week and half of it next week or whatever. Sorry. So my last work in progress is another new piece, and it's out of a yarn that you guys saw over in my post-Christmas episode. I bought some when I was down in Texas visiting my old local yarn store. Hey, sweetie, can you get comfy? Okay. And this is Monoso Uruguay, the Fino, which is their light fingering weight. It's about 500 yards to 100 grams. And it's 70% merino, 30% silk, a single ply, and this is the Rosewater colorway. And when I was a new knitter, I would go to the store, and I loved this yarn every time, but I didn't know what I would do with it. So when I went over Christmas, the yarn store was having a great sale, and it was kind of pricey. So I just admired it from afar. But the yarn store was having a great sale, and now I know that I enjoy knitting shawls, so I treated myself to a skein with my grandmother's Christmas money. And yeah, so I decided that I was going to design my own shawl because, apparently there are no limits to my knitterly confidence, even though I've only knit 2 other shawls. Can you see where this is going? So I'm calling this my Dawn's Rosy Finger shawl, which is after Homer, of course. And I wanted something that was mainly texture because the colorway is so feminine that I didn't feel it needed a lot of lace. And I really like how bouncy single plies are, and I didn't want to have to lose that by blocking it hard to open up the lace. So I swatched a bit, and I found a texture stitch pattern that was fun to knit and that I really liked the results of. And then I found a small, very simple mesh lace to insert that I also liked the looks of and that was fun to knit, because I found the longer a shawl gets, the more I'm kind of annoyed at how long it gets. So it's important that whatever stitch I'm doing is enjoyable. Anyway, so then I cast on and I began knitting. And I knit, and I found these directions for various ways to shape a shawl, and I was following the directions for shaping a wedge crescent circle. And I thought, this is perfect. It'll sit right around my neck and shoulders. It'll be so wonderful. So pleased with myself. And so I knit about half the skein, so about 200 yards. I'll get to why half the skein is 200 and not 250 in a minute. And I put it on a longer cable and I tried it on, and I discovered that since it was a circle shape, there was no draping right here. So it sat perfectly around my neck and shoulders, but it pretty much looked like a very beautiful bib. I'm not going to wear a shawl that looks like a bib. So I ripped it all out. And I started again using a different shaping style. And it's going quite well again, except this poor yarn. I mean, single plies are not strong to begin with, so I felt really bad having to frog it and reknit it, but it's handling itself. So this time I started the shaping with a triangle because I decided that would really look neat with the stitch too. And now I've changed the shaping now that I'm on the second textures section, so that hopefully the ends will still wrap easily around my neck and shoulders, but I'll get a good amount of drape right here. Fingers crossed, guys. I'm not sure if this yarn could stand up to being frogged and re-knit with again. Anyway, so before I started knitting it, I weighed the skein because I wanted to track my yardage, and I discovered it was only 89 grams when it's supposed to be 100. And that seemed really short to me, so I posted on Instagram, and my knitting friends suggested that I go ahead and contact the company. So I was a little nervous, but I emailed them, and they were great. They replied back and said that they would send me a replacement skein. So I sent them my address, and I will let you guys know when that came. But I was really impressed with their customer service, and, you know, there were no questions asked. It wasn't a begrudging thing at all. It was, oh, that shouldn't have made it out of quality control. Let me fix it. So I am definitely in love with this color and with Manos at Uruguay in general. It is a cooperative style company that employs rural women in Uruguay. So I really like that style business model. And then, so I'm trying to keep good notes of what I've been doing. And I'm thinking about writing this up as a free pattern, if anyone would be interested. I've used so many free patterns on Ravelry over the years, and I've been so grateful to all the resources that other knitters put out there for common consumption, and I would really like to give back. I haven't done it with any of my sweaters because unless you're like my body twin, it wouldn't be terribly useful. But with a shawl, I figure that that's pretty unisex, and I think that this texture would look really good with hand spun or other variegated yarn. And the way that I'm knitting it, I think it'd be pretty easy to adjust for yardage, and I would include those types of notes. So I think that it could be useful for other people. I especially like that it's not going to require hard blocking, so you can kind of see what size it is as you knit, which for a shawl newbie like myself is pretty important because it's really hard for me to visualize what a shawl is going to look like after blocking. I'm just not used to it. Anyway, so do let me know if you would be interested in me writing up the pattern and making it available. I know that there are tons of patterns for shawls already available on Ravelry, so I mean, if it would be just a drop in the bucket, then I don't want to bother you guys. But if there is interest, then I would definitely need a few test knitters. I couldn't offer you money, and it's going to be a free pattern, so pretty much the only incentive would be my undying gratitude and, of course, immediate support on anything that is unclear and that kind of stuff. So if you would be interested in test knitting, as I said, it's going to take about 100 grams of fingering weight, but I think it would be easily adaptable to sport or light fingering or that kind of thing. Then get in touch via Ravelry would probably be easiest, a PM. And yeah, let me know if you think that I should write up the pattern. Man, when you're trying to take notes instead of just improvising, it slows down your knitting, but that's a good thing in my case. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the year, my knitting goal is to knit more slowly, and I've been doing really well at that until these last 2 weeks. There were days where I didn't knit at all because of my health, but other than that, I just let myself knit. So I was probably knitting more like 3 or 4 hours a day instead of 2. So that's why I've got quite a bit to show you guys. And, you know, I was reading this book about moss. It's an excellent book. It's called Gathering Moss, and it's by a biologist. Anyway, and she was talking about how when she was in graduate school, I'm trying to find the quote, that's why I'm looking at my phone. Does anyone else take photographs of book passages? Hang on. Okay. Here it is. When she was in graduate school, she studied this wall of moss, basically, and she discovered that there was the most variety of species in between where, like, the intermediate level of disturbance. So where sometimes something would happen, but other times it was clear, instead of the steady areas of nothing at all and always something happening. And so that made me feel better about not always balancing knitting with the rest of my life. Sometimes I get overly enthusiastic, and that's okay. Be back. Moth is not impressed that I keep interrupting her nap just when she gets to the good part of her dreams. So, I went to my local yarn store and I wanted taupe colored socks. So I walked in and I was so nervous, and they were really friendly, and they asked if there was anything they could help me with, and I said I was looking for sock yarn, and they have their shop sorted by weight. So that was really easy. And then I saw the price tags and I was like, oh my goodness, I did not realize yarn was so expensive. And at the time I had pretty much no spending budget. I mean, maybe $10, $20 of fun money a month. So that really narrowed down my options right there. But luckily they carry Barocco Alpaca Fine, which retails for I think $12 or $13 a skein. And it comes in a lovely taupe color. So I got that, and I went to check out, and I needed needles as well. So I got some size 2 DPNs, just bamboo. And the yarn store kindly caked my skein up for me. It was funny, the owner was checking me out, and she was like, do you want us to wind your yarn for you? And then she went, nod your head yes, because I didn't even know. So yeah, she was very friendly. And she also, at that point, I mentioned that I was still doing the Norwegian purl, that it's a bit hard on my wrist. So she just was knitting something and went ahead and showed me the way that she purls, which is the way I purl now, Continental, and it's so much easier. So yeah, she no longer owns the store. She sold it to another woman who was equally as friendly. But yeah, I had a wonderful experience with my first local yarn store. Okay, so I went home, and in addition to the skein, I had gotten Wendy Johnson's socks from the Toe Up book out from the library. I have no idea why I decided the Toe Up socks would be easier than Top Down. And so I decided to do a short row toe because the short row toe and the short row heel work exactly the same. So I figured that way I could learn one thing and I'd be good. So I started, and it was really hard for me to keep track of the wraps and that kind of stuff, so I think I knit the toe like 3 times, but I managed it. And then first I was going to do her dead simple lace pattern, but oh my gosh, because of the name, it sounded like it would be good for beginners. Checking my heating pads. But for some reason, I still don't know what I was doing, but whenever I tried to knit the yarn overs, I was closing them, so I must have been twisting them. But when you try to Google for that information, pretty much all that comes up is accidentally putting yarn overs in holes in your work. So that was even more frustrating, that I'm like, no, the holes won't appear. So I just decided that clearly lace was not in the cards, so I went with one of her Guernsey patterns. Traditional Gainsey socks. Because I was like, well, I can knit and I can purl, and that will be fine. So that's what I did. She describes, well, the smallest stitch count she usually has is 64 stitches, and so that was, I didn't realize for quite a while that 64 stitches is really too many for my foot. But so I worked my way up, and I did my short row heel, and I worked all the way up to the leg, and then for the ribbing, I did twisted ribbing to make it look neater, and then I looked up and did that sewn 1x1 invisible rib bind off that I found on the internet. And so I was absolutely thrilled, but while I was knitting the sock, I was also looking up ways to loosen tension, because it's a lot more comfortable physically, more ergonomic if you're not a super tight knitter, at least for me. And so I started my second sock, and I got all the way up to about here, and I realized that my gauge had loosened so much that this sock would have fit my father. So I had to go back to the yarn store and buy size 0 needles and pull it all out and start it all over. But eventually, I think it took me 2 months, but I had a pair of socks, and I was so pleased. And that's really when I started to get bit with the knitting bug. but it wasn't until I had to very slowly work up how much I could knit with my body. I had to kind of train my body. And then I also now have more spending money than I used to. So that's part of why I'm able to knit so much more than I used to. But I will. So in addition to the hats, pretty early on I decided that I wanted an interchangeable circular needle set, and I wanted it to be made in the US, and I wanted it wooden. So that meant Diet Craft. They're darn pretty needles, which have a 6-month waiting list. So in October of 2013, I put myself on the waiting list. You don't have to pay until your needles are ready. I ended up getting mine as a birthday present for a full set of the DPNs, because clearly, I mean, my very first projects are pretty much on DPN, so I knew that I liked them. And then the interchangeable circulars, and I ended up getting them for my birthday from my very generous parents. So that meant that I knew that they were coming, so I didn't want to buy any more needles. So for the first year that I was knitting, because I got my darn pretty needles in April of 2014, I only knit on a pair of size 2 DPNs, size 0 DPNs, a 16-inch size 7 circular cable, and then the size 7 DPNs, because I did end up with a set of that. So that's why I pretty much only knit socks and hats for my first years, because I didn't have other needles. So my second pair of socks was another Wendy Johnson pattern with short row heels and toes, but I decided that I would not let lace conquer me, so this time I chose a lace pattern, and this is also out of Barogo Ultra Fine. Clearly I like teal. The double eyelet rib, and I knit these while I was on an adventure in Ecuador, so that was really fun. Socks are very portable, and I have lots of good memories tied up in those. And then meanwhile, I decided that I needed a gray hat, and I searched the patterns on Ravelry, but I couldn't find any that were what I wanted, so I just decided to knit it myself. So I got a skein of Malabrigo worsted, and I knit in moss stitch, and then I did my crown decreases, and I added a pom-pom, and clearly then I liked my hats gigantic, and it turned out a little bigger than I intended because I didn't really know what I was doing. But yeah, so I started designing, if you can call it that. I started winging my own way, let's say, quite early on, just because I'm very particular. And if I can't find a pattern that looks like what I want, well, then I have to figure out how to make it myself. And meanwhile, I was reading knitting books, and I discovered Elizabeth Zimmerman, who, if you have not read her yet, she is wonderful. Her books are as much personal essay, creative nonfiction as they are how-to knitting guides, so they're really wonderful just to read for pleasure. And she is all about empowering you as a knitter. And so, since those are some of the first books I read, it never occurred to me that I couldn't just strike out on my own. So then, I'll show you one more hat. This was the third hat that I made. It's a free pattern from Knitty. It's called the Bramble hat, and I made the largest size because apparently I only wanted gigantic hats. This is out of Lamb's Pride worsted. I was only buying yarn from my local yarn store, and I was never stashing. I would just finish a project and then go get yarn for the next project. But I was often limited as to they don't carry a lot of my favorite muted colors, which is fine. I mean, the area in Texas is known more for bright colors, so I don't blame them. But it did kind of limit my yarn selection, so that's why I ended up with this. And this hat, I finished it, and it's knit brim up, and I tried it on, and the brim was way too big. And I did not want to have to knit the whole thing again, because, it's pretty complicated when you're a beginning knitter, so it took a really long time. So I cut the ribbing off. I cut one stitch, and then I unraveled the round. And I picked up the stitches and re-knit the ribbing down and cast off. And that worked perfectly. And I still wear this. I think that this pink is a little cool for me. I'm not sure. And nowadays I tend to wear smaller hats, but I do still wear it. I refilled my water, and I took off my cardigan because I've closed the windows to help with the noise. And so it's a little warm with multiple heating pads on you. So I was also knitting gifts for others, but I don't have those as props, so that's why I was talking about my own knitting. And The other thing that I did a lot when I was a beginner knitter, because I had more enthusiasm and more time to spend on knitting than I did money, is, I would play with the yarn. So my grandmother asked me for a pair of knitted socks and left the money for the yarn and everything. She's silly. But so once I bought the yarn, this is what I would do with everything, but I just happen to have this one. To decide what pattern I was going to make, I would do just a little swatch, not for gauge, but just to try out different stitches so that I could see. Oh, hopefully that's the focus. I'm trying to find that focus box. So that I could see how different stitches would behave. So I tried out all these different rib patterns to find one that I thought would suit her best. I ended up doing the Skype rib socks, I believe. Yeah, this one. But yeah, so that's the kind of thing that I would do when I was an early knitter. And I just expected everything to take forever. I didn't knit plain stockinette, anything. I just assumed I would be bored knitting plain stockinette, so I only knit patterned things for about the first year. I finally, in April of 2014, I was making some gifts for a friend for her baby shower, and I had some leftover yarn from the baby blanket, so I made a little vest for her baby using the Pebble Vest pattern, and that has a mainly stockinette body, and I was shocked at how quickly that went. And that's the first time that I knit something in stockinette. So that's the story of how I began knitting. As far as what skill level I would put myself at, I would say I'm at a strong intermediate level. Oh, can't get comfy. I'm definitely no longer a beginner, but I feel like I have quite a few areas that I have a lot to learn in, and I guess I won't consider myself advanced until, so for instance, on the cable cardigan that I'm designing right now, I wanted the back to have a panel, and I wanted it to be a panel of interlocking cables, and I wanted it to be more complex than it did turn out, but I couldn't figure out how to chart that and how to design it myself. So I guess I'll consider myself advanced when I can design all my own stuff, like stitches and cable charts. But that's just my thing. I mean, I don't know. It's not like anyone is gonna ask for my card, and take away my knitting card if I say that I'm intermediate and not advanced. But since she wanted to know, that is where I would put myself. And then the final question she had is, what is my approach? Clothes, art, relaxation, math. I would say all of the above. Oh, I hope I'm in focus. I really enjoy style, and I really enjoy kind of achieving my little personal vision of outfits, and so I like designing clothes that work into that. But I also find knitting incredibly relaxing. So I enjoy pretty much every stage, and I would say that part of why I have become so passionate about knitting as a hobby is because it's able to satisfy both the creative and technical side and let me work with my hands as well as my brain and kind of bring what I can imagine to life. So finally, I have the graphs for you. I promised you graphs. So first up, and these are all thanks to Ravelry, which is just a magical Yarny database. Okay, so this is the graph that I call the rise of a passionate knitter. So in 2013, you can see I knit 2,105 yards in 9 projects. In 2014, I knit 8,943 yards in 34 projects. And last year, in 2015, I knit 17,580 yards in 62 projects. So yeah, I feel like the graph says it all there. Clearly, I'm spending more and more time and interest and money on knitting. And then I did a few graphs breaking down all of those projects just out of my own curiosity. I don't know if you guys will enjoy these as much as I enjoyed making them, but let's see. So this one are the projects by category. as you can see, hats and things you wear on your hands tie with 25 each. Feet come very close with 24. And then, ooh, that's hard to read backwards. Let's see, softies, which is hilarious because I would never call myself a softie knitter. I don't really enjoy knitting them that much, and I don't think I'm very good at them, but I do have a niece who I love a lot. So I've knit 19 of those. And then I've knit 9 sweaters, which includes 2 baby sweaters. Well, the vest and a sweater. And these are my neck category. Clearly I came very late to neck accessories. I've only got 9 of those, and then 4 miscellaneous. Yeah, so knitting in the round is obviously my favorite thing. I'm still adjusting to shawl knitting and how the rows get longer and longer as you go. I've never knit anything like that before, and it occasionally makes me lose heart. Okay, so this is by color. Brown, gray, oh, hang on, I have a little key here. Blue, blue-green. Those are all my biggest ones. And remember, these are for other people as well. And then natural, undyed, and white. I'm never sure what to put in which category. Black, which is never for me. I don't wear black. Red. Pink. What is this? Green, purple, and yellow. So I've been feeling kind of funny that I've been knitting so much pink lately, but clearly I've got a long way to go to catch up with my blue and blue-green obsession. And then the other 2 are yardage and yarn weight. So lace, light fingering, sport, DK, worsted, Aran, and super bulky, which was the yarn for my great-great-aunt's muff. And then by yardage per project, this is 1 to 150, 150 to 300, 300 to 450, 450 to 600, 650 to 750, 750 to 900, 900 to 1200. So those are my sweaters and a blanket. And these are Ravelry's categories since I found it easiest to just transfer it. So yeah, in case you found that interesting, I just find this one hilarious. Just in case you needed visual evidence that I've become a very devoted knitter. There it is. And that is all I have to say in that category, shockingly. I think we're finally finished with the topic. Once again, I apologize for what a long episode this is. Next episode, I will be talking a little bit more about what I'm going to call the ghost of knitting present. So I'm going to keep the theme going throughout March. And now, I will begin Knits in the Wild. Since I've talked so much already, I'm only going to talk for the outfits, and then I'm just going to show the accessory combinations really quickly, one after another, instead of, detailing everything. All of my projects are on my project page, so you can always track them down that way. But before I forget, I wanted to say I've started using the Knits in the Wild hashtag on Instagram, and I don't, photos I post on Instagram are with my phone, so I'm not going to put them in the podcast. So if you're interested in that, follow me on Instagram. I'm the Charm of It there as well. Oh, I forgot to say that in the intro, didn't I? I'll do it at the end. Anyway, and I encourage all of you to start sharing your Knits in the Wild as well. I'm going to start a thread in the forum in case you'd like it to be a little more private, or on Instagram, and I would really love that. As I was saying before the cut, I would really love to see your knits in the wild, because that way I can see how you style your hand knits. And of course, if you would like me to include them in the podcast, just message me on Ravelry and I'll have you send higher resolution photos to my email and I will happily include them. So I've got 4 outfits to show you today. First, I wore my thistledown sweater and I managed to not take any photos of what I was wearing it with. I apologize. Pretty sure I was wearing it with a full skirt. Then I styled my peacock scarf, which is a little shorter than the scarves I usually wear, so I've been playing with it, but I styled it like a cravat with a very fitted, thrifted sweater, and then a full skirt and some fun tights and knee-high socks. Then I wore my Guernsey sweater again with my corduroy skirt and matching taupe tights and teal socks because I love matchy. And finally, and this was what I wore yesterday, I wore my newly finished knee highs over some leggings and a tunic, and then I added my little peacock yarn collar. I should be calling it my antiquarian collar, I'm sorry. And when I said peacock scarf, it's the antiquarian scarf on my Ravelry page. So I added that little collar to kind of echo the dark, moody colors, and that kept me super comfy and happy on a nice lazing around Saturday. As you can see, it was eminently suitable for reading and snuggling with Bristol. So now I'm going to add in all of my accessory photos, but without a vocal commentary. I believe we've almost come to the end of this episode. I wanted to quickly say, first, since I didn't say it at the beginning, you can find me on Ravelry, Instagram, and my blog, The Charm of It, Everything. So I welcome everyone getting in touch. I really appreciate it. I started this podcast in order to make friends, and so I just love that it's worked so well. We have a podcast group, which is The Charm of It as well, if you would like to come join. And we're not super active, but we definitely do chat, and I'm going to start a thread for us to share projects that we're super proud of so that we can do a little more cheerleading. I was thinking about hosting a knit-along. I know that there are a lot of knit-alongs, so let me know if you would be interested in this. The theme would be modifying, because I thought that way those of us who have more experience with modifying patterns or designing from scratch can help those of you who would like to be able to do that but are a little nervous about it. So you would have us as a resource. And the modifications could be anything from small to large. And yeah, we would just be there to cheerlead, to answer any questions you might have, that kind of thing. Of course, if it's a paid for pattern, we might not be able to help you as much as if you use a free pattern, because we won't be able to see the paid for pattern unless we also own it. And I was thinking about calling it the With Hope and Confidence Knit Along, because that's one of my favorite Elizabeth Zimmermann quotes, and I think that she's very inspiring as far as encouraging you to go your own way with your knitting. But I also don't want to be presumptuous. So let me know what you guys all think of that. And then I wanted to say really quickly, in the next probably 1 or 2 episodes, I'll have a work in progress that I can't show until the end. So Debbie, if you're watching, look away now. So Debbie is my friend who I'm making water for elephant socks for. And they're colorwork socks, and she knows the pattern, but she had me surprise her with the yarn. She told me the dark colors that she liked and told me to pick the light one. So the yarn arrived this week, and I'm so excited about it. It's Quince & Company Finch, because I love them and their yarn. And I did the apricot color, so that's going to be the background, and Sabine. And these, if you don't know the pattern, it used to be free. That's when I got it, but now it's $4, and it's worth it. I used it to knit a pair of socks for my mother last year that are just wonderful. Anyway, it's very kind of Indian inspired. So I thought that these colors, I wanted it to kind of glow and then have the delicate lines tracing over top of it. It was tricky to choose colors because Debbie does not wear super feminine combinations like I do, so I had to kind of be careful about that, but she wears a lot of really beautiful warm tones. So yes, there will be a little secret section at the end of the next few episodes, because I can't not show you the little elephants as they progress. But I also want to keep it a surprise. They will not be on Instagram, since Debbie is on Instagram. Whew. I believe that now I can say goodbye. Thank you so much for tuning in. I had a great time talking with you guys, as always. And if you'd like to connect further, I'm probably most accessible via Instagram, but I'm happy to chat with Ravelry too. It's just usually a little more delayed. Have a wonderful 2 weeks, and I look forward to talking with you guys again soon. Bye.